Saren had never been afraid of wolves. She'd grown up in the kennels of Thornwall Castle, surrounded by hounds with teeth longer than her fingers, and temperaments that could shift from sweet to savage between one breath and the next. She knew how to read an animal's posture, how to calm a snarl with the right tone, how to make herself small when smallness was survival. Wolves were just larger dogs with worse reputations. That was what she'd always believed anyway. But the wolf, standing in the middle of the courtyard at dawn, her cloak still draped across its back, was not just a wolf. It was enormous. Taller at the shoulder than any hound she had ever raised, with fur the color of iron streaked through with silver and eyes like pale winter moonlight. It stood pressed against her leg with the weight and warmth of something that had decided, without question or negotiation, that it belonged exactly where it was. Saren stood very still. Around her, the courtyard had frozen. Two guards by the gate stared with their hands on their sword hilts, neither one drawing. A kitchen boy who had been hauling a water pail stood with his mouth open and the pail tipping slowly sideways, water sloshing over his boots. The kennel master, a barrel-chested man named Haddon who feared nothing with 4 legs, had gone pale enough to match the morning mist. The wolf growled. It was a low sound, more felt than heard, rolling through the flagstones and up through Saren's bones. One of the guards had shifted his weight forward just half a step, and the wolf's head snapped toward him with a precision that turned Saren's blood cold. Its lips peeled back. The teeth beneath were not hound teeth. They were weapons. The guard stumbled backward. "Easy," Saren murmured, her hand dropping to the wolf's scruff without thinking. "Easy. You're all right." The growl stopped. Just like that. The wolf's massive head turned back to her, and it pressed its nose into her hip with a low, shuddering exhale, like the tension drained out of it the moment she spoke. Its tail didn't wag. Wolves didn't wag. But something in its posture softened in a way that made no sense for an animal this size, this wild, this clearly dangerous. "Saren." Haddon's voice was strained. "Step away from it, slowly." "I don't think that's going to work," Saren said, because the wolf had just laid down across her feet. She could feel the heat of it through her thin boots. The weight of it pinned her in place. Its ribs expanded with each breath, pressing against her ankles, and she realized with a strange, delayed shock that the shivering she'd felt last night, the full-body tremors that had racked the animal from nose to tail, were gone. It was calm, warm, at peace, and it had absolutely no intention of moving. "What do we do?" the kitchen boy whispered. Nobody answered. Then footsteps echoed from the eastern archway, sharp and purposeful, and a man stepped into the courtyard. He was tall, lean, dressed in dark leather with his dark hair cropped short, and his face carried the kind of deliberate calm that came from long practice at hiding alarm. Saren had seen him before at a distance, always 2 steps behind the king. Merrick, the king's beta. His gaze swept the courtyard, landed on the wolf, and every trace of color drained from his face. He stopped walking. For 3 full seconds, Merrick did not move, did not breathe, did nothing but stare at the wolf draped across Saren's feet with her faded green cloak still hanging over its back. Then his eyes lifted to hers. "Do you know what that is?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Saren looked down at the wolf. It yawned, showing every single one of those terrible teeth, and then tucked its nose beneath its paw like a dog settling in for a nap. "A wolf," she said. Merrick's jaw tightened. "Come with me. Now. Don't argue, and don't take the cloak back." "I can't come with you," Saren pointed out. "It's lying on my feet." As if it understood her, the wolf rose. It shook itself once, her cloak shifting but not falling, and pressed its flank against her thigh, ready to walk wherever she walked. Merrick stared at it for a long, unreadable moment. "Then bring it with you," he said. Saren followed him across the courtyard, the wolf stalking beside her like a shadow made of muscle and iron-colored fur, and every person they passed went silent. She had no idea what was happening. But the look on Merrick's face, the look of a man watching something impossible and terrifying unfold in real time, told her that whatever she'd done last night was far more significant than giving a cold animal her cloak. It had started so simply. The previous evening, long after the castle had quieted and the hounds were kennelled for the night, Seren had heard something outside the walls. Not a howl that she could have ignored, but a sound that was worse. A high, thin whimper threaded with a kind of suffering that made her throat tighten. She'd found the wolf in the tree line beyond the outer wall. It was lying on its side in the frost-hardened grass, trembling so violently that she could see the spasms from 20 paces away. Its breath came in shallow, ragged bursts that fogged the air in uneven plumes. It looked like it was dying. Seren had knelt beside it before reason could stop her. Up close, the wolf was staggering in its size, but it didn't snap at her. Its pale eyes found hers, and what she saw in them wasn't animal instinct or feral warning. It was exhaustion so deep it had moved past fear entirely. She'd pulled the cloak from her own shoulders and laid it over the wolf's body. Then she'd sat beside it in the cold, her hand resting on its flank, and talked. Not about anything that mattered. Just her voice filling the silence because animals calmed when you talked. And this one needed calming more than any creature she had ever seen. Within minutes, the trembling stopped. Within an hour, the wolf was asleep, its massive head resting against her thigh, its breathing slow and deep and peaceful. Seren had stayed the whole night. She hadn't meant to. But every time she shifted, the wolf stirred. And every time she settled, it sank deeper into rest, and she couldn't bring herself to take that from it. By dawn, when she finally stood, the wolf stood with her, and followed. And now she was walking through the corridors of Thornwall Castle with a wolf the size of a small horse pressed against her side, and the king's beta leading her somewhere she was not cleared to go, and her heart was hammering with the certain knowledge that she was in enormous trouble. Merrick led her through corridors she had never walked before. Upper levels, where the stone was smoother, and the tapestries weren't moth-eaten, and the air smelled of beeswax instead of tallow. The wolf padded beside her in perfect silence, its claws clicking softly on the flagstones, its shoulder brushing her hip with every step. Servants pressed themselves against walls as they passed. A woman carrying linens actually dropped them. Seren wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, but she had nothing to explain with. She didn't know what was happening any more than they did. Merrick stopped at a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands and knocked once. A muffled voice from inside said something she couldn't make out, and the beta pushed the door open. The room beyond was a private study. Maps pinned to the walls, a desk drowning in papers, a fire burning low in the grate. And standing beside the window with his back to them, a man whose silhouette alone made Seren's mouth go dry. She'd seen King Emeric Valdane exactly 3 times in her life. Always from a distance, always in armor or formal dress, always surrounded by people important enough to stand near him. He was the kind of figure who existed more as an idea than a person to someone like her. A presence felt at the edges of castle life, like weather or the turning of seasons. Up close, with the gray morning light carving the planes of his face, he was something else entirely, taller than she'd realized, broader. His dark hair was disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it, and the hollows beneath his eyes were deep enough to hold shadows. He looked like he hadn't slept in months. He turned when the door opened, and his gaze went straight past Merrick, past Seren, and landed on the wolf. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but recognition, and beneath it, something raw and wounded that disappeared so fast she almost missed it. "She's the one?" His voice was low, rough, like it hadn't been used much recently. "She's the one," Merrick confirmed. "It slept the entire night. I had Haddon confirm." The wolf didn't stir once. The king's gaze moved to Seren, and the full weight of it hit her like a physical force. Gray eyes, pale and sharp, that seemed to see straight through her clothes, her skin, her pretenses, down to whatever she was underneath all of it. "What's your name?" he asked. "Seren," she managed. "Seren Vale. I work in the kennels, Your Majesty." His eyes dropped to the wolf, which had moved even closer to her, pressing so tightly against her leg that she had to brace her stance to stay upright. "And you gave it your cloak," he said. Not a question. "It was shivering," Seren said, then added quickly, "I didn't know it was yours, Your Majesty. I found it outside the wall in the frost, and it looked like it was suffering, and I just thought—" "You thought you'd wrap your cloak around a wild wolf twice your size and sit with it in the dark." His voice was flat, impossible to read. Seren swallowed. "I'm good with animals." Something crossed the king's face, something she couldn't name, and his gaze cut to Merrick. A silent conversation passed between them in the space of a breath. The beta gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I need to ask you something," the king said, turning back to her. "And I need you to answer honestly." "Of course, Your Majesty." "Has the wolf been aggressive toward you? At any point?" "No," Seren said immediately. "It's been gentle." "Has it tried to leave your side?" "No. It follows wherever I go." "And when you touched it last night, what happened?" Seren hesitated, trying to find the right words. "It stopped shaking, almost immediately, like the cold just drained out of it." She paused. "I don't know why." Emmerich studied her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room to the desk and braced both hands on its surface, his head dropping forward between his shoulders. The posture spoke of exhaustion that lived in the marrow. "Merrick," the king said, without looking up. "Arrange the trial for tonight." Seren's pulse spiked. "Trial?" "Not a trial of guilt," Merrick said quickly, seeing her face. "A test. We'd like you to be present during a controlled situation tonight, to see whether the effect repeats." "What effect?" Seren asked, her gaze darting between them. "What is this about? Whose wolf is this?" Neither man answered immediately. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then the wolf at her side did something unexpected. It crossed the room, slow and deliberate, and pressed its head against the king's hand where it rested on the desk. Emmerich flinched. Not away from the wolf, but inward, like the contact hurt somewhere deep inside him. His fingers curled, almost unconsciously, into the fur at the wolf's neck. His eyes closed, and for just a second, his expression cracked open into something so full of grief that Seren had to look away. Then it was gone. The mask slid back into place. He straightened. "Take her to the eastern wing," he told Merrick. "Give her a room, proper meals, whatever she needs. She doesn't leave the grounds." His gaze returned to Seren, and the command in it left no room for negotiation. "You'll come to my chambers at sundown. Tell no one what you've seen here." "Your Majesty," Seren started, her voice thin. "Am I in trouble?" The king looked at her, and for just a moment the mask slipped again. Not grief this time, something quieter, almost gentle. "No," he said, "but I might be." The wolf followed her out. It followed her down the corridor into the eastern wing, into the small but clean room that a bewildered servant had prepared on absurdly short notice. It followed her to the narrow bed and lay down across the doorway like a sentry, its pale eyes tracking her every movement. Seren sat on the mattress and pressed her hands against her knees to stop them from shaking. She kept seeing it, the way the king's fingers had curled into the wolf's fur, the way his face had broken, the way the wolf had gone to him not like a pet to its master, but like one half of something returning to the other. And a terrible, half-formed suspicion began to crystallize in her mind. The wolf wasn't just the king's. The wolf was the king. At noon, a woman stepped into Seren's room without knocking. She was older, perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe knot and hands that moved with the practiced economy of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring doses and setting bones. Her eyes were dark, sharp, and entirely unsentimental. "Seren Vielle," she said, as if confirming a diagnosis. I'm Orla, chief healer to the crown. The wolf lifted its head from its paws but didn't growl. It watched Orla with those unsettling pale eyes, then set its chin back down. It tolerates me? Orla observed, pulling a chair to the bedside. That's new. It's tried to take Merrick's hand off twice. What I'm about to tell you, Orla continued, settling into the chair with the air of someone delivering news she wished she didn't have, is known to exactly 4 people in this castle. If you repeat it, the consequences will be severe, and I don't mean punishment from the crown. I mean the kingdom falls apart. Are we clear? Seren's stomach turned to ice. We're clear. 3 years ago, the king fought a war against a rogue pack led by an alpha named Drakkar. The conflict lasted 8 months. Villages burned, supply lines were severed. Civilians died on both sides. It was ugly. Orla paused. When it ended, the king killed Drakkar in single combat. But Drakkar didn't go quietly. With his last breath, he spoke a curse. Blood magic. Old and vicious. The kind that roots itself in the bond between a shifter and their wolf. Seren's gaze dropped to the wolf lying across her doorway. The curse is severing them, Orla said. Slowly, like a blade sawing through rope, one thread at a time. The king's wolf manifests on its own at night, ripped out of him against his will. And every time it manifests, it suffers. The cold, the convulsions, the agony you saw last night, that is the curse torturing the wolf to break the king. 3 years, Seren breathed. 3 years of this and no one has been able to stop it? We've tried everything. Every remedy in my stores, every healer in the eastern provinces, every scholar who's written a word about blood magic or shifter bonds. Nothing works. The wolf manifests, it suffers, and by dawn it returns to him weaker every time. Both of them weaker. Orla's expression tightened. He's dying, Seren. The bond between a shifter and their wolf is the core of what they are. When it finally snaps completely, he won't survive it. No alpha would. Seren looked at the wolf. It was watching her with those pale, quiet eyes, its breathing slow and steady. Calm, for the first time in what she now understood, was 3 years. But last night, Orla continued, was the first time the wolf has been at peace since the curse began. Merrick has been monitoring the king's condition nightly. When the wolf manifests, Emric feels everything it feels. Every tremor. Every spasm. He lies awake in agony until dawn. But last night, when you sat with it, he slept. For the first time in 3 years, the king slept through the night. The silence that followed pressed against Seren's shoulders like a physical weight. We need to know if your presence consistently calms the wolf, Orla said. If it does, we need to understand why, so we can replicate it. And if you can't replicate it? Orla held her gaze. Then you may be the only thing standing between the king and death. The hours until sundown passed like years. Seren tried to eat and managed half a meal. She tried to rest and failed. When the knock came, she was already standing. A guard escorted her through the upper corridors. The castle felt different at this hour. Heavier, like the stone itself was holding its breath. She entered the king's chambers alone. The room was vast. A fire burned in the hearth, casting shifting amber light across dark wood and stone. Weapons hung on the walls, a broadsword, a hunting bow, a shield bearing the Valdane crest, arranged with the precision of someone who kept them within reach, not just for display. And the bed, wide and imposing, dominated the far wall. Emric stood beside the hearth. He'd changed into a loose shirt with the laces undone at the throat, and the firelight turned the exhaustion on his face into something carved and stark. He looked like a man bracing for pain he already knew was coming. This is a clinical arrangement, he said without greeting. You will sleep here during the nights when the wolf manifests. A cot has been prepared. He gestured toward a narrow pallet against the far wall. You will not be disturbed. You will not be touched. This is a medical necessity. Nothing more. If at any point you are uncomfortable, you are free to leave. I understand, Seren said. Then, before she could stop herself, Does it hurt? When the wolf comes out? A muscle tightened in his jaw. It's manageable. That's not what Orla told me. Orla talks too much, he muttered. The fire popped. The wolf, which had been standing beside Seren, crossed the room and lay down in front of the hearth. It set its head on its paws and sighed, a sound so deeply content it seemed to belong to a different animal entirely from the one she'd found in the frost. Emmerich watched it with an expression that made something tighten behind Seren's ribs. Longing and loss and a grief so private she felt like an intruder for witnessing it. "Thank you," he said quietly, still looking at the wolf. "For the cloak. You didn't have to do any of that." "It was cold," Seren said simply. "Most people would have run." "Most people don't work in kennels." The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the scaffolding of one. The faintest blueprint of what a smile might look like on a man who had forgotten the architecture. They settled into silence. The curse came without warning. One moment Emmerich was sitting on the bed, and the next his shoulders hunched forward and his jaw locked, and a tremor ran through him that she felt from across the room. His hands gripped the mattress, tendons standing rigid. The wolf rose, body stiff, its form flickering like heat haze. Emmerich made a sound, low and bitten off, that was unmistakably agony. His body doubled forward. The wolf collapsed with a sharp yelp that drove a spike through Seren's sternum. She was on her knees beside it before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Her hands found its fur, and the animal was shuddering, violent tremors racking its frame. "I'm here," she whispered, pulling its head into her lap. "You're all right." The shuddering slowed in stages, like waves pulling back from a shore. Within minutes, the tremors stopped, and the wolf exhaled a long breath and went still against her. Emmerich was watching from the bed, pale and sheened with sweat, his eyes fixed on her hands in the wolf's fur with something between wonder and fear. "It's asleep," she said softly. "Already?" He said nothing. But his grip on the mattress loosened, and after a long moment, he lay back against the pillows. Within 10 minutes, he was asleep too. Seren sat on the floor with the wolf's head in her lap and stared at the fire and tried to understand what she had become a part of. In the morning, the wolf dissolved at dawn. Its weight vanished. Its warmth evaporated. And across the room, the king opened his eyes. They stared at each other in the pale light, and for 3 heartbeats, neither spoke. Then the mask returned. He sat up and looked away. "Same arrangement tonight. The healers will examine you during the day to ensure there are no adverse effects." At the threshold, Seren paused. "It dreams," she said, not turning around. "Your wolf? When it sleeps, it dreams. Whatever it was dreaming about, it wasn't afraid. I thought you should know." The silence was absolute. Then, very quietly, in a voice stripped of every defense, the king said, "It's been afraid for a very long time." Seren left, and the door closed behind her, and she stood in the empty corridor and pressed her fist against the hollow ache beneath her ribs that had no name and no intention of going away. A rhythm formed, reluctant and fragile, like a heartbeat finding its pace after a shock. Every evening, Seren arrived at the king's chambers after the castle had settled into its nighttime quiet. She set up her things on the cot, which had improved steadily over the past 2 weeks, in ways the king refused to acknowledge. The thin blanket had become 2 thick ones. A proper pillow had replaced the flat slab of cotton she'd started with. A woven rug had appeared beneath the cot's legs, shielding her from the cold stone. "The rug is new," Seren remarked one evening, towing it with her boot. "Is it?" Emmerich said without looking up from the report he was reading at his desk. "It matches the curtains." "A coincidence?" "It also smells like cedar, like the storage chests in the royal linen closets." Emmerich turned a page. "You seem to have a very detailed knowledge of how the royal linen closets smell." Seren bit back a smile and said nothing. During the days, their lives did not touch. He ruled the kingdom from war rooms and council chambers. She returned to the kennels, tending the hounds, cleaning runs, mending the leather leads that the younger dogs chewed through with cheerful determination. Nobody asked where she went in the evenings. Merrick had seen to that with a story about specialized healing sessions that required her presence in the upper wing. But the evenings were hers and his. That strange, suspended space between sundown and the moment the curse took hold, when they were two people sharing a room and trying not to notice how much the silence had changed. Saren had started talking to fill it. Not about anything important. Stories from the kennels, mostly. The hound who'd learned to unlatch his own gate and kept leading midnight adventures across the courtyard. The time she'd spent 3 hours tracking a missing pup only to find it asleep inside the head cook's largest stew pot. The ongoing territorial dispute between the oldest hound, a dignified creature named Bracken, and a castle cat who had claimed Bracken's bed and refused to negotiate. She talked about growing up in the kennels too, sometimes. Not much. Just fragments. The old kennel master who'd taken her in when she was small, who'd given her a name because she'd arrived without one, left on the castle steps on a night full of stars. She mentioned it the way she mentioned everything about herself. Lightly. Like it didn't weigh anything. If Emmerich noticed the weight beneath the lightness, he didn't say. She didn't know when he'd started listening. He never responded while she spoke. He sat at his desk or on the bed, reviewing documents or staring at the fire, his face giving nothing away. She assumed the words went in one ear and dissolved. Then, one evening, as she was unlacing her boots, he said, "The cat." Saren looked up. "What?" "The one that stole Bracken's bed. Did it ever give it back?" She stared at him. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the fire, his jaw set in that careful, controlled way she was beginning to recognize as his version of feeling exposed. "No," Saren said slowly. "Bracken sleeps on the floor now. He's very dignified about it, but I can tell he's furious." "Understandable," Emmerich said. "Being displaced from your own bed is an indignity." Saren glanced at the cot she slept on every night, 3 feet from the king's actual bed, and pressed her lips together very hard. "I imagine it is." He caught her tone. His gaze flicked to her, and she saw it happen. The crack. The slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth, a flash of warmth that surfaced and vanished before it could fully form. It was the closest thing to a real smile she'd ever seen from him. Then the curse hit, and the moment vanished with it. She'd learned to read the signs by now. The locked jaw, the hitched breathing, the tension that gathered across his shoulders like a storm building over flat ground. She'd moved to the floor near the hearth without being asked, and by the time the tremors started and the wolf manifested in a shimmer of pain and light, she was ready. The wolf came to her every time. It would stumble from the king's body, wretched and convulsing, and cross the room and collapse against her. And every time, Saren gathered it close, hands in its fur, voice low and steady, her body a barrier between the animal and whatever was trying to destroy it. It broke her heart nightly. The sounds it made in those first minutes before her presence took hold, the high, thin whimpers that were worse than howling because they sounded so human. But then the convulsions would ease, the wolf's breathing would slow, its massive body would relax against hers, warm and heavy and trusting in a way that made something dangerous bloom behind her ribs. Tonight, as the wolf settled into sleep, something was different. It shifted closer than usual, pressing its nose against the hollow of her throat, and she felt its breath there, warm and steady, and a low vibration resonated through its body. Not a growl, not a whimper. A sound she'd never heard a wolf make, deep and rumbling and content, almost like a purr. Then it did something that stopped her breath entirely. It nudged her. Not roughly, but with deliberate, insistent pressure, pushing its head under her arm and steering her sideways, toward the bed. Saren resisted. "No," she whispered. "I sleep on the cot, remember? That's the arrangement." The wolf nudged harder. Its pale eyes found hers in the firelight, and the intelligence there was so unmistakable, so pointed, that it felt less like an animal's instinct and more like an opinion. "I am not getting in the king's bed," Seren hissed. The wolf huffed, a sound of pure exasperation, and laid its head across her ankles. Its message was clear enough. If she wouldn't go to the bed, then neither of them were moving. Seren looked at the cot. She looked at the wolf. She looked at the king, who was asleep on the bed with one arm hanging over the edge, his face peaceful and unguarded in a way that made something tighten inside her that she refused to examine. "Fine," she muttered to the wolf, "but we're not talking about this in the morning." She pulled the blanket from the cot and wrapped it around herself on the floor. The wolf curled against her side like a furnace made of fur and bad decisions. The stone was cold beneath her, but the wolf was warm, and its heartbeat was steady against her ribs. And somewhere in the space between discomfort and exhaustion, she fell asleep. In the morning, when the wolf dissolved at dawn, Seren was left lying on the floor beside the king's bed, with her blanket tangled around her legs and her hair in her face. Emmerich looked down at her from the mattress. "Why are you on the floor?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep and something that might have been alarm. "Your wolf has opinions about sleeping arrangements," Seren said. A beat of silence. "Strong opinions," she added. Something passed through his expression. Not amusement. Softer than that. Warmer. "I'll have a thicker rug brought in," he said. "Or," Seren countered, sitting up and pulling a strand of hair from her mouth, "you could tell your wolf to respect boundaries." "It's a wolf," Emmerich said. "It doesn't understand boundaries." Seren gave him a look that suggested she had thoughts about who else in this room didn't understand boundaries, but she kept them to herself. She stood, gathered her things, and moved toward the door. "Seren?" She stopped, turned. He was sitting on the bed, and the morning light was catching him at an angle that softened the sharp edges. He looked less like a king and more like a man, tired and grateful and uncertain. "The hound," he said. "Bracken. You should give him a second bed. Let the cat keep the first one. Sometimes surrender is the more dignified option." Seren smiled. She couldn't help it. "I'll consider it, Your Majesty." 17 days into the arrangement, the curse came early and it came wrong. Seren had barely settled onto the cot when Emmerich doubled over at his desk. There was no warning, no slow build, none of the familiar signs she'd learned to read. One moment he was writing, and the next his pen clattered to the floor and his body seized like a bowstring drawn past its limit. The sound he made turned her blood to ice. Not the bitten-off grunt she'd grown accustomed to, but something torn from deep inside him, a sound that didn't belong in a human throat. His hands gripped the desk's edge so hard the wood groaned beneath his fingers. "Emmerich!" She was on her feet before the word finished leaving her mouth. She'd never used his name without the title before, but formality had no place in the sound he was making. The wolf manifested violently. It didn't shimmer into existence the way it usually did, easing from the king's body like a shadow separating from its source. It ripped free. One moment Emmerich was hunched over the desk, and the next the wolf was on the floor, convulsing, its body arching and twisting as if something inside it was trying to claw its way out. Seren dropped to her knees beside it. Her hands found its fur, but it was different tonight. The wolf was cold, colder than she'd ever felt it, as if the warmth had been drained entirely. Frost clung to the tips of its fur. Actual frost, crystallizing in the fire-lit room like something pulled from a winter that didn't exist here. "I'm here," she said, pulling the wolf's head into her lap. "Come back to me." The wolf's eyes opened. Not the pale, steady gaze she knew. These were wild, unseeing, fixed on something that wasn't in the room. Its mouth opened in a silent howl, and Seren felt it, a pull behind her sternum, sharp and cold, like a hook sinking into the center of her being. She gasped. The room dissolved. Cold hit her first. Not winter cold. Not the honest bite of frost on skin, but a cold that came from inside, from the bones outward, as if her marrow had turned to ice. The air smelled of iron and ash. The ground beneath her knees was hard, glassy, and when she looked down, she saw black ice stretching in every direction. a frozen wasteland. The sky was the color of a bruise, purples and grays pressed so low they seemed to touch the ground. There were no stars, no moon, no wind. Just a vast, suffocating stillness that pressed against her eardrums like being held underwater. The wolf was there. It lay 20 feet ahead, on the ice, and it was chained. Thick bands of black iron circled its neck and legs, bolted to the frozen ground. Frost coated its fur in a solid sheet. Its breathing was shallow, labored, each exhale a thin cloud that froze before it could rise. "No," Seren breathed. She ran to it. The ice burned her bare feet, but she didn't stop. She reached the wolf and grabbed the chains, pulling with everything she had. The iron was so cold it seared her palms. She yanked anyway, tears streaming down her face. "Let go of it," she snarled at the wasteland, at whatever cruelty had built this place. "Let it go." The chains didn't budge, but at the edges of the wasteland, where the bruised sky met the black ice, shapes were forming. Dark figures, tall and angular, made of shadow and frost. They glided closer in a ring that tightened with every second. The wolf whimpered. The sound was so small and broken, coming from something so large that something cracked inside Seren's heart. Then she saw it. Where the chains met the ice, where the iron bolts drove into the frozen ground, there were fractures. Tiny cracks spreading outward like veins. And through the cracks, she could see something underneath. Not more ice, fire, dim and distant, but alive. Burning far below the frozen surface like an ember buried in ash. The wolf's heartbeat and the fire were synchronized. The fire was the wolf's life, buried and suppressed by the curse, but not dead. The shadow figures were close now. They whispered in voices made of wind over empty places. "He doesn't deserve warmth. He earned this cold. Every chain is a life he took." The whispers pressed against her mind, trying to push her down, trying to make her believe. And for a terrible moment she felt the pull of it. The seductive weight of despair. Then the wolf's nose touched her hand. Just a nudge. Weak. Barely there. But warm. Seren grabbed onto that warmth with everything she had and pulled. She woke gasping on the floor of the king's chambers. Her hands were still tangled in the wolf's fur, and her palms burned like she'd held them over open flame. The wolf was still against her, its breathing ragged but steady. Across the room, Emric was sitting bolt upright on the bed, his chest heaving. Sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. His eyes, wide and haunted, were locked on her face. "You were there," he said. Not a question. Seren's teeth chattered. The ice, the chains. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had hardened behind the gray. "Then you understand why I need you to stop touching it. When you touch it during an episode, you're being pulled into the curse. I felt you there tonight." "I saw the fire," Seren said, her voice raw. "Underneath the ice. There's still. It doesn't matter what's underneath." He stood, putting distance between them. "You are not going back there. That place will kill you." "It's killing you," she shot back. "That is not your problem." The wolf pressed its head harder against her with a low, distressed sound. Emric looked at it against her. She watched him fight something, saw the war play out across his face, need against fear, desperation against the rigid certainty that he had to protect her even if it destroyed him. "Same arrangement tomorrow?" she asked carefully. "No. Whatever you saw tonight, that's the reality of what lives inside me, and I won't be responsible for dragging you into it." "Emric." "That's an order, Seren." The word order landed between them like a closed door. She left his chambers with the wolf still pressing against her legs, refusing to stay behind. And when the door closed, she heard something on the other side that she would carry with her for days. The sound of a man sliding to the floor. And silence. After 8 days. That was how long it took for the absence to become unbearable. Seren hadn't been summoned, hadn't been sent for. The door to the upper corridors remained firmly closed to her, And when she'd tried to go on her own the second night, a guard she didn't recognize had turned her back with an expression that said the order had come from the top. She'd stood in that corridor and felt the rejection land like a fist. He'd locked her out, not just from his chambers, but from the wolf, from the nightly ritual that had become the axis around which her world had quietly, terrifyingly reorganized itself. And the loss of it was physical. It started with the restlessness, a crawling sensation beneath her skin that no amount of work could burn off. She cleaned every kennel twice. She reorganized the feed stores. She mended leads that didn't need mending. Her hands wouldn't stop moving because if they stopped, she'd feel it. The pull behind her sternum, the magnetic ache that pointed toward the upper wing like a compass needle that couldn't find north. Then came the headaches. Blinding, pulsing pressure behind her eyes that forced her to work with the shutters drawn. Light became an assault. Sound sharpened until the hound's barking drove spikes through her temples. Then the cold. Not real cold. The castle was warm enough, but Saren couldn't shake the chill. She layered blankets on her bed in the eastern wing and still woke shivering, reaching across the mattress for a warmth that wasn't there. She had no family to worry about her. She'd never had family. Not really. The kennel master who'd raised her had been kind, but he was years gone now, and the castle steps where she'd been left as an infant offered no comfort in the dark. She dreamed of ice. Every night, the frozen wasteland crept into her sleep. The black ice, the bruised sky, the chains. She'd wake with her hands burning and the taste of ash on her tongue, and she'd lie in the dark and breathe through the terror and try to convince herself it wasn't getting worse. It was getting worse. On the fourth day, she caught a glimpse of Emmerich crossing the lower courtyard. Just a flash, his tall frame unmistakable even at a distance, surrounded by advisors. She stopped walking, her entire body oriented toward him without her permission, every nerve straining forward, and the ache beneath her ribs flared so sharply she had to brace against the wall to keep standing. He didn't look at her. Not a glance, not a flicker. He walked past the courtyard entrance and was gone, and the absence he left behind was worse than the cold. On the sixth day, Merrick found her in the kennels. "How bad?" he asked, looking at her with the clinical assessment of a man used to evaluating threats. Saren straightened. "I'm fine. You've lost weight, you're not sleeping, and you've reorganized the feed stores 3 times this week." He paused. Haddon is concerned. Haddon worries about everything. Merrick studied her for a moment longer, then said quietly, "He's worse." The words sliced through her carefully maintained composure. "How much worse?" "The wolf's manifestations have doubled in frequency. It comes during the day now, not just at night. He had an episode in the middle of a council session yesterday, collapsed behind the table before anyone could react." Merrick's voice was measured, controlled, but she could hear the fear beneath it. "He's barely eating, barely functioning. The healers are with him around the clock, and nothing they do makes any difference." Saren gripped the kennel gate. "Let me see him." "He's forbidden it." "Then unforbid it." Merrick shook his head. "I can't override a direct order. Not on this." He hesitated. "But there are things that happen in this castle without the king's explicit knowledge. Schedules that overlap, corridors that intersect." His gaze held hers. "Counselor Aldrin has requested the kennel master send someone to check the hounds assigned to the eastern garrison. The request came through proper channels. You'd simply be following orders." Saren stared at him. "The eastern garrison shares a corridor with the council wing?" "Does it?" Merrick said flatly. "I hadn't noticed." Saren went. Not because it was a good plan, not because she thought seeing him across a corridor would fix anything, but because 8 days of not seeing him at all was eating her alive, and she needed to know he was still standing. The eastern corridor was quiet. She carried a lead and a muzzle as props, the tools of someone on legitimate kennel business, and walked with the forced steadiness of a woman who was not falling apart. She heard the council chamber before she saw it, voices through an open door, Aldrin's reedy tenor, another advisor she didn't recognize, and beneath it all, a voice that made her heart lurch with desperate, devastating relief. Emric. She slowed as she passed the open doorway, allowed herself one look. It nearly broke her. He was seated at the head of the table, but the man she saw bore almost no resemblance to the king she'd left 8 nights ago. His face was gaunt, the hollows beneath his eyes so deep they looked carved. His skin had taken on an ashen pallor that made the dark of his hair look stark and wrong. His hands, resting on the table, trembled. He was dying. She could see it, as clearly as she could see the maps on the wall and the documents stacked before him. Seren's vision blurred. She blinked hard, forced herself to keep walking past the door. Her hands shook. Her lungs felt compressed by invisible hands. She made it 11 steps past the council chamber before the floor tilted. It happened the way Orla had warned her it might. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet surrender. The strength simply left her legs. Her vision went white at the edges, then gray, then narrowed to a single point of light that shrank and vanished. The lead and muzzle clattered to the stone floor, and she heard her own name from somewhere very far away. Seren. The voice cut through the gray like a blade, sharp, raw, and so full of anguish that it didn't sound like a king or an alpha or anything with walls. It sounded like a man watching something he loved fall. Arms caught her before she hit the ground. She felt herself pulled against a broad chest, felt hands cradle the back of her head, felt a heartbeat slamming beneath her ear so hard it shook through both of them. She tried to open her eyes. Couldn't. But she could hear. Merrick's voice, urgent and low, feet running on stone, and Emric's voice above her, giving orders in a tone that no one in the corridor dared disobey, his hand pressed against her face like he was checking that she was real. Then, softer, so quiet she almost missed it. Don't do this. Please. Not you. She woke in the infirmary. The light was low, the air heavy with dried herbs and linen, and when she turned her head, Emric was beside her bed, his head in his hands. When he heard her stir, he looked up. The relief that flooded his face was so total, so unguarded, that Seren's breath caught. He looked like a man pulled back from the edge of something catastrophic. "You're awake," he said. "I'm awake," she confirmed, her voice a rasp. His hands hovered over her, wanting to touch, not daring. "What happened? Have you been eating? Have you? Seren interrupted quietly. He stopped, his jaw tightened. Orla stepped forward from the doorway. "I've been patient with both of you," she said, and her voice carried the weight of a woman who had reached the absolute end of her tolerance for noble self-destruction. "I've respected the king's orders. I've given Seren space. I've waited for one of you to develop the common sense the gods gave a turnip." She folded her arms. "I'm done waiting." "Orla," Emric started. "You share a bond," Orla said flatly. "A mate bond, forming, incomplete, and currently tearing you both apart because you refuse to be in the same room." The silence that followed was deafening. Seren looked at Emric. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his jaw so tight she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. "I know about the bond," he said quietly. "Hey, then you know what separation does," Orla pressed. "The headaches, the cold, the physical deterioration. Everything she's experiencing mirrors your decline. The bond is trying to complete itself and you are both fighting it, and it is killing you. Not slowly anymore." She paused, letting the words settle. "Fast." Emric's hands clenched against his thighs. "If she stays near me, the curse pulls her in. I won't. If she stays away from you, you both die." Orla cut him off. "The curse is accelerating because your wolf has no anchor. She is the anchor. Without her, the wolf's manifestations will increase until the separation is total, and when that happens, you will not survive it." She turned to Seren. "Neither will you. Not anymore. The bond has progressed too far." "How long?" Seren asked. Orla's gaze didn't waver. A month. Maybe less. Emmerich stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the stone floor. He looked at Seren, and what she saw in his face wasn't anger or denial. It was devastation. The look of a man trapped between two impossible choices, and every path led to her getting hurt. "I need to think," he said. He turned and left the infirmary without looking back. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp and deliberate, each one a little faster than the last. Seren watched the empty doorway. The hollow inside her was so vast it didn't feel like pain anymore. It felt like geography, like someone had carved a valley into her and left it open to the sky. Orla waited until the footsteps faded before turning to her with one eyebrow raised. "He said he needs to think," Seren murmured. "He's been thinking for 3 years," Orla replied. "Thinking is not what that man needs." "What does he need?" "Someone stubborn enough to save him despite his best efforts to prevent it." Orla looked at her steadily. "I've watched you with those hounds for years, Seren. I've seen you coax a half-feral wolfhound into eating from your hand after 6 weeks, when every handler before you gave up after 2. She paused. "The king is a wounded animal who bites when you reach for him. You already know how to handle that." Seren stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside her. Not the ache. That was still there, vast and hollow and hungry. But beneath it, like fire beneath ice, something older and fiercer. She was done waiting for permission. Seren found Merrick in his office that evening. He was standing at the window, looking out at the darkening courtyard, and he turned when she entered with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting her. "I need to get into his chambers tonight," Seren said. Merrick studied her for a moment. "He's given explicit orders that you're not to be admitted." "I know. He'll be furious." "I know that too." Merrick leaned against the window frame, crossing his arms. "I've served Emmerich Valdane for 11 years. I've watched him fight a war, bury friends, and carry a curse that should have killed him twice over. In all that time, I have never once seen him afraid." He paused. "Until you collapsed in that corridor. The sound he made when he caught you, that wasn't a king giving orders. That was a man watching the world end." Seren's throat tightened. "Then let me in. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." Merrick straightened. "When the wolf manifested during the council session 2 days ago, it didn't thrash. It didn't convulse. It dragged itself to the door and clawed at the wood until its paws bled." He held her gaze. "The door that leads toward the eastern wing, toward you." Seren pressed her fist against the ache beneath her ribs. "I can get you through the upper corridor," Merrick said. "The night guard on the king's door is Aldrin's man. He owes me a favor." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." His expression sobered. "Once you're inside, it's your fight. I can open the door, but I can't make him stop being a stubborn fool. That's on you." She went at moonrise. The corridors were empty, the castle wrapped in the deep silence of late evening. Her footsteps sounded too loud on the stone. Her pulse was louder. The guard at the king's door glanced at her, then stepped aside without a word. Seren pushed the door open and stepped inside. The chambers were dark except for the fire, which had burned down to embers. The room felt different from what she remembered. Colder, more hollow, as if the absence of the wolf's nightly peace had seeped into the walls themselves. The cot was gone. The rug was gone. Every trace of her presence had been removed. Seren moved to the hearth and knelt. She fed the fire until it caught properly, until warm light spilled across the floor and pushed the shadows back. Then she sat on the edge of his bed and waited. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the outer hall, heavy and uneven in a way they hadn't been 3 weeks ago. The door opened and Emmerich stepped inside and froze. He stared at her the way a man stares at something he's convinced himself he'll never see again. His hand stayed on the door handle. His chest rose and fell once sharply, and she watched the war ignite behind his eyes. Need and fear and fury and relief, all of it colliding in a single breath. "Seren." Her name came out wrecked. "Before you order me to leave," she said, "I need you to answer one question." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here." "One question. Then if you want me gone, I'll go. And I won't come back." The silence stretched taut enough to snap. Then he released the door handle and stepped inside, letting it close behind him. "Ask," he said. Seren stood. She crossed the space between them slowly, watching his eyes track her approach, watching his hands clench at his sides. She stopped close enough to see the pulse hammering at the base of his throat. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Being away from me?" Something cracked behind his expression. Not the mask. Something deeper. A wall he'd built 3 years ago and reinforced every day since with discipline and duty, and the absolute conviction that he deserved every ounce of suffering the curse delivered. "Seren, don't." "Because it's killing me," she said. "Being away from you. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I dream of the ice every night, and I wake up reaching for a wolf that isn't there, and the cold doesn't stop. It never stops." Her voice broke on the last word, and she watched him flinch like she'd struck him. "So I need to know. Is it the same for you?" He closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. "It's worse," he said, and the word came out like a confession dragged from somewhere he'd sworn never to open. "It is so much worse. I feel you in the walls of this room. Your scent is in every corridor I walk through, and I can't breathe past it. The wolf throws itself against the inside of me every night trying to reach you, and I hold it back because I'm terrified that if it finds you again, the curse will follow, and I will have destroyed the only—" He stopped. His throat worked. "The only what?" Seren whispered. "The only person who ever made it stop hurting." She kissed him. She rose on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, and for one terrible second he didn't respond. His body went rigid, his hands hovering at her waist without landing, every muscle locked in the final stand of a man trying to do the noble thing. Then his hands closed around her waist and pulled her against him, and the noble thing shattered into 1,000 pieces. He kissed her like drowning, like breathing, like a man who'd been holding his breath for 3 years and finally broke the surface. His hands found her hair, her jaw, the curve of her neck. He backed her against the bedpost, his body pressing into hers with a desperate, urgent need that told her he'd been fighting this with everything he had, and everything he had wasn't enough. "If you stay," he said against her mouth, his forehead pressed to hers, "I won't be able to let you go again." "Good," Seren said. "Seren, I'm staying." She pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes. "I'm staying because I choose to. Not because Orla told me I'd die. Not because the wolf needs me. Because I need you, and you need me, and we've wasted enough time pretending otherwise." He stared at her for one long, suspended moment. Then something shifted behind his eyes, a surrender so complete it transformed his entire face, and he kissed her again. Slower this time, deeper. He pulled her against him and held her like the world might try to take her away again if he let go. They stayed like that for a long time, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other in. Seren felt the bond between them tighten, brighten, humming like a wire pulled taut between two fixed points. When he buried his face in her hair and breathed her in like she was the only air left in the world, she understood what Orla had meant about the bond completing itself. It wasn't just a connection, it was a homecoming. He pressed his lips to her shoulder, and the bond snapped into place. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, like a lock clicking home. A golden thread anchored itself in the center of her being and reached across to his. She felt him, not beside her, but woven into the deepest part of her, his presence settling into a space she hadn't known was empty until it was filled. She pressed her lips to his shoulder in return, marking him as hers the way he had marked her. The bond flared, completed, sealed. They held each other in the quiet that followed, his arm wrapped around her waist, his forehead resting against the back of her neck. His breathing had gone slow and deep in a way she hadn't heard since the early nights of the arrangement. Then the wolf came, not violently, not with pain or convulsion or the terrible ripping that she'd come to dread. It shimmered into existence beside the bed, quiet and calm, and stood there in the firelight with its pale eyes fixed on both of them. It wasn't shaking. For the first time since she'd known it, the wolf wasn't shaking at all. It stepped forward, lowered its great head, and pressed its nose against their joined hands where they rested on the sheet. Then it lay down beside the bed, tucked its nose beneath its paw, and sighed. Seren felt tears slip down her face. Beside her, Emmeric's arm tightened around her waist, and his breath hitched once against her hair. They slept, all three of them together, in the warm, amber dark. Seren opened her eyes to ice. The frozen wasteland stretched in every direction, vast and silent and terrible. The bruised sky pressed low overhead. The air tasted of iron and grief. But something was different this time. She wasn't cold. The bond hummed warmly, a thread of gold in a world drained of color. And beside her, his hand already wrapped around hers, stood Emmerich. Not diminished. Not on his knees. Standing, his shoulders straight, his jaw set, his gray eyes taking in the wasteland with the expression of a man revisiting a battlefield he'd left years ago, but never truly escaped. "We're here together," he said. His hand tightened around hers. The bond brought us both. The wolf stood between them, solid and calm, its iron-colored fur unmarred by frost. The chains that had bound it were still there, bolted to the ice, but the wolf wasn't wearing them. They lay empty on the ground, the iron bands open like jaws that had lost their grip. "It's free," Seren whispered. "No." Emmerich's voice was heavy. "Not yet. Look." She followed his gaze. At the center of the wasteland, where the ice was thickest and the darkness deepest, the chains converged. Not on the wolf, but on a shape she hadn't seen before. A figure, kneeling on the ice, head bowed, wrists bound by the same black iron that had held the wolf. It was Emmerich, another version of him, stripped of title and armor and pretense, wearing the blood-stained clothes of a soldier who'd just walked off a battlefield. He knelt in the ice as if he'd been there for years, which she realized with a sickening lurch he had been. Every night for 3 years, this version of him had knelt here and accepted the chains as his due. "That's what the curse really holds," Seren said, understanding flooding through her. "Not the wolf. You. Your guilt." The shadows at the edges of the wasteland began to gather. They moved inward, condensing, taking form. Not the faceless shapes she'd seen before, but people. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, their faces drawn with sorrow, their eyes reflecting the flat, dead light of the frozen sky, the dead of the war. They formed a ring around the kneeling figure, and their whispers rose like wind through a ruin. "You ordered the march. You lit the fire. We burned." Seren felt Emmerich's hand spasm in hers, the real Emmerich, the one standing beside her, alive and whole and breaking apart from the inside. "The village of Ashwick," he said, his voice barely audible. "Drakhar's forces retreated through it. I ordered the pursuit. The fires spread." His throat worked. There was a granary. Families had taken shelter inside. One of the figures stepped forward from the ring. A boy, 12, maybe 13, his face smudged with soot, his arms cradling something against his chest. A smaller child, limp, barely breathing, wrapped in a blanket that was singed at the edges. Seren's eyes burned. "He ran toward our line," Emmerich continued, each word dragged from somewhere deep and bleeding. "Carrying his sister, trying to reach safety. And one of my men, in the smoke, in the chaos. He didn't see. He didn't." The boy stopped 3 paces from the kneeling version of Emmerich and held out the child in his arms. "You were supposed to save us," the boy said. The kneeling Emmerich's head dropped. His chains clinked against the ice. And from the man beside her, the real one, Seren felt a wave of guilt so vast it nearly pulled her under. It was an ocean, a geography, the landscape of a man who had carried the weight of every life lost under his command and folded it into a sentence he repeated to himself every single night. I should have seen them. I should have been faster. I deserve this. The curse fed on it. She could see it now, the way the ice thickened beneath the kneeling figure with every repetition, the way the chains tightened, the way the shadows pressed closer. The curse wasn't strong. Orla had been right. The magic itself was a thread, a seed, a whisper. But Emric's guilt had given it a cathedral to echo in, and for 3 years it had grown fat on his belief that he deserved every frozen second. Seren let go of his hand. Emric turned to her in alarm, but she was already walking forward, past the wolf, past the ring of the dead, toward the kneeling figure at the center of the ice. She knelt in front of him. The chains radiated cold so intense it burned, but the bond held steady, a furnace against the frost. I know what this is, she said softly. The kneeling figure didn't lift his head. I know why you stay. She looked at the boy with the child in his arms, at the ring of faces watching with sorrow that had long since passed into patience. They were waiting. Not for vengeance, she realized. Not for punishment. They were waiting for him to let them go. I was left on the castle steps when I was 3 days old, Seren said. The words came out steady, rooted, drawn from a place she'd never shown anyone. No name, no note, no reason. Just a blanket and the sound of footsteps walking away. She swallowed. I spent my whole life believing it was because I wasn't enough. That if I'd been different, better, more, they would have stayed. I made myself useful to everyone around me because I thought if I stopped being useful, I'd be abandoned again. The kneeling Emric's head lifted slightly. It took me 23 years to understand that their leaving wasn't a verdict on my worth, Seren continued. It was a decision they made, in a moment, with whatever broken reasons they had. And I could carry it forever, or I could set it down. Her voice thickened. Carrying it didn't make me loyal. It didn't make me good. It just made me small. She reached out and placed her hand over the kneeling figure's chained wrists. What happened at Ashwick was a horror, she said. Those people deserved better. That boy deserved to live. And nothing will change that. No amount of nights on this ice will bring them back or undo what was done. Tears fell onto the frost and didn't freeze. But you punishing yourself in the dark where no one can see isn't justice. It isn't penance. It's just a man alone in the cold, and it helps no one. Not them. Not you. She looked up at the boy. His face had changed. The soot was fading. The accusation in his eyes had softened into something that looked, impossibly, like compassion. They don't want your suffering, Seren whispered. They want your peace. Because your peace is what lets them rest. The kneeling Emric's breath hitched. A crack split the ice beneath his knees, thin and sharp as a whip snap. Then another. Then a web of fractures spreading outward, and through the cracks, warm golden light poured upward like dawn breaking through a frozen lake. Let them go, Seren said. Let yourself go. The kneeling figure raised his head. His eyes, gray and raw and ancient with grief, met hers. I'm sorry, he said. Not to her. To the boy, to the ring of the dead, to every face that haunted the frozen dark. I'm sorry I wasn't fast enough. I'm sorry the fire reached you. I will carry your names for the rest of my life, but I am putting the chains down. The boy looked at him for a long, still moment. Then he shifted the child in his arms, and something extraordinary happened. The soot on his face vanished. The burns on his hands healed. The smaller child stirred, blinked, and wrapped her arms around her brother's neck. The boy smiled. Small and sad and real. He turned. The dead turned with him. One by one, they walked toward the edges of the wasteland, and as they crossed the boundary where ice met sky, they dissolved. Not into shadow, into light. Soft, warm, amber light that spread across the frozen ground like sunrise. The chains shattered. The ice cracked open, and the fire beneath surged upward, flooding the wasteland with warmth that drove the bruised sky back until it broke apart into something clear and vast and full of stars. The kneeling figure dissolved. The wolf threw back its head and howled, a sound so full of joy and release that Seren's heart split open with it. Emmerich caught her, the real Emmerich behind her, his arms wrapping around her as the frozen world fell apart around them, pulling her against him as the ice melted and the stars blazed and the wolf's howl rang through a sky that was finally free. Seren woke in his arms, in his bed, in the warm amber dark of the king's chambers. The fire had burned to embers. The wolf lay at the foot of the bed, its fur gleaming in the low light, its breathing slow and peaceful and utterly without pain. Emmerich was awake. He was looking at her with eyes that shone in the ember light, and his face was wet, and he was smiling. Not the scaffolding of a smile, not the blueprint. The real thing, whole and unguarded, transforming his entire face into something luminous. He cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the tears on her skin. "Thank you," he whispered. "For the cloak. For all of it. For everything." Seren pressed her forehead against his and laughed through her tears. "You're welcome." The wolf sighed in its sleep, and the sound was the most peaceful thing she had ever heard. The curse didn't shatter like glass. It receded like a tide, slowly, over weeks and months, pulling back a little further each day. Emmerich still had nightmares. Some mornings Seren woke to find him rigid beside her, his jaw locked, his hands fisted in the sheets. She'd press her palm against his chest and feel the bond pulse between them, warm and steady. And his breathing would ease, and the nightmare would loosen its grip. And he'd turn toward her in sleep, the way a compass needle turns toward north. The wolf's manifestations grew gentler. Where once it had been ripped from him in agony, now it emerged like an exhale, quiet and natural, a wolf stepping out of its den at dusk. It no longer shuddered, it no longer whimpered. On good nights, it didn't manifest at all, and Emmerich would wake with a look of quiet wonder and say, "It stayed inside, the whole night. It stayed." The reunion was slow. The bond between shifter and wolf, nearly severed by 3 years of curse and suffering, knitted itself back together one thread at a time. The first time Emmerich shifted on purpose, standing in the courtyard under a full moon with Seren's hand on his shoulder, the wolf that emerged was whole, strong. Its fur gleamed iron and silver in the moonlight, and its pale eyes were clear, and when it turned to look at Seren, its tail swept once across the flagstones. She knelt and buried her face in its fur, and the wolf pressed its nose against her heart, and Emmerich, the man inside the beast, felt both of them complete. The court adapted, as courts do, with a mix of genuine warmth and barely concealed scandal. A kennel keeper as the Alpha King's mate was not the match anyone had predicted. The whispers followed Seren through every corridor, every banquet, every public appearance at Emmerich's side. She heard them. She didn't flinch. "They'll adjust," Emmerich told her one evening, pulling her close in the privacy of their chambers. "And those who don't can take it up with their king, who is, for the record, unreasonably devoted to his mate." "Unreasonably," Seren repeated, smiling against his chest. "Completely without reason," he confirmed. "A scandal, really." Months passed. The castle softened around them, or perhaps they softened around the castle. Seren kept her work in the kennels, because she loved it, and because the hounds needed her, and because Bracken had finally reclaimed his bed from the cat, and she wanted to be there to witness the triumph. Emmerich ruled with steadier hands and clearer eyes, and a patience that his council attributed to improved health, and that Merrick attributed, with a rare smile, to love. On a morning in late spring, Seren woke to pale gold light and the sound of birdsong through the open window. Emmerich was asleep beside her, his face peaceful, one arm draped across her waist. No nightmares, no ice, no chains. At the foot of the bed, the wolf lay curled in a patch of sunlight, her faded green cloak still folded beneath its head like a pillow it refused to surrender. Seren smiled. She settled back against Emmerich's shoulder, felt his arm tighten around her, and closed her eyes. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the castle stirred, and the world moved forward into a morning that was warm and bright and new.